The Iron Maiden. Deep beneath the cobbled streets of medieval Europe, where light seldom touched the ground and whispers carried farther than screams, there stood a relic, or perhaps a nightmare, known as the Iron Maiden. Few saw it and lived to tell the tale. And yet its legend lives on, not through the voices of its victims, but through the shiver that creeps up your spine when you merely hear its name. The Iron Maiden was not simply a device. It was a place of no return. Shaped like the human form itself, it stood tall, its doors looming like the jaws of some forgotten beast. Its very shape mocked those who stood before it, as if it were saying, "Step inside and meet your reflection." Within, dozens of cold, unforgiving spikes waited in silence, but they did not strike like the sword or the spear. No, their cruelty lay in patience. They waited for the doors to close, slowly, deliberately, until escape was no longer a word that could be spoken. But the question that haunts historians is simple. Did the Iron Maiden ever truly exist in the way we imagine it? Or was it a ghost conjured by later generations to remind the world of its own darkness? Some believe that the earliest accounts of the Iron Maiden appeared not in the Middle Ages, but centuries later, in the 18th or even 19th century, when Europe was both fascinated and horrified by tales of its brutal past. In Nuremberg, Germany, an Iron Maiden was put on display as an artifact of medieval cruelty, though evidence suggests it may have been crafted for that very display, never once used in its supposed time. Still, legends have a way of gripping the mind more firmly than facts, and whether the Iron Maiden was ever truly used as an instrument of torment or merely a warning cast in iron, its power lay in what people believed about it. Imagine the scene: a cold stone chamber, the air damp and thick with silence. A lone torch flickers against the far wall, casting trembling shadows across the iron face of the maiden. Its expressionless surface stares back at you, neither angry nor merciful. The guards speak little, for what is there to say? In this moment, words are meaningless. Only the sound of the creaking hinges matters. Only the slow groan of the iron doors as they open, revealing the dark hollow within. They say the spikes were placed with care, not to strike vital organs, but to pierce just enough to inflict pain without causing the end too soon. A cruel design, if true. The person within would remain conscious of their fate, trapped between life and the cold embrace of steel. Every movement would invite agony, every breath a reminder that they were still alive, for now. And yet, in the centuries since, many scholars have doubted whether the Iron Maiden was ever actually used in this way. Some argue that no medieval executioner would have gone to such elaborate lengths when simpler, swifter methods were at their disposal. The Iron Maiden, they suggest, was never a tool of justice or punishment, but a creation of fear itself, a theatrical symbol of ultimate control. In this light, the Iron Maiden becomes less a historical device and more a metaphor, a testament to how societies control their people, not always through action, but through the threat of action. No one needed to be locked inside for the fear to spread. All it took was the story, whispered in alleyways, told in frightened tavern corners, scrawled in the margins of forbidden books. But whether or not it was ever truly used, the Iron Maiden has left an indelible mark on our collective imagination. Even today, replicas of the device stand in museums across Europe and beyond, drawing curious crowds who peer cautiously into its hollow form. Visitors wonder, was this the final sight of some forgotten soul? Did someone centuries ago stand exactly where I am now, staring into the darkness of those jagged iron teeth, feeling their heart pound against their chest? It's strange, isn't it, how sometimes what we fear most is not what is, but what could be. The Iron Maiden may never have claimed a victim, but it claimed the minds of countless who feared it. Its power lay not in its spikes, but in the imagination of those who thought about what those spikes could do. Picture this: a prisoner led down the twisting corridors of an ancient castle, each step echoing in the emptiness. They know where they're going. They have heard the stories. Maybe they believe them, maybe not. But as they reach the chamber and see the maiden waiting, all doubts vanish. In that moment, it doesn't matter if the stories were true. The fear is real. And that fear, like the Iron Maiden itself, is inescapable. In a way, we all have our own Iron Maidens. fears we build in our minds, stories we tell ourselves to keep us in line. They may not be forged from steel, but they confine us just the same. Silent, looming, waiting for the doors to close. And so the Iron Maiden stands as a relic of more than just history. It is a reminder of how easily fear can shape reality. Whether it was ever used or not, it fulfilled its purpose perfectly. It made people obey. It made them hesitate before rebelling. It made them wonder, in the quiet hours of the night, whether the stories were true. Even now, when you hear its name, some part of your mind imagines it coming to life. Rusty hinges groaning open, the cold darkness inside waiting to embrace you. And though centuries have passed, and the Iron Maiden is little more than an artifact behind museum glass, its shadow lingers on. Because some devices don't need to be used to leave a scar on history. All they need is for someone to believe in them. The rack. In the dim recesses of medieval castles, where sunlight never dared to tread and hope seemed like a forgotten word, there lay a simple yet terrifying construction. Two wooden rollers at either end, ropes stretched taut, and a sturdy frame to bear the strain. It wasn't elegant like the Iron Maiden, nor concealed behind closed doors. No, the rack was brazen in its cruelty. Open, mechanical, and horrifyingly effective. Unlike some devices whose existence is debated, the rack was all too real. It was not merely a legend whispered through the ages. It was a machine of certainty. Historical records across Europe, from England to Spain, detail its use during interrogations and trials, most notably during the dark days of religious persecution and political unrest. The genius of the rack lay in its simplicity. At first glance, it was nothing more than a wooden frame. But when someone was fastened to it, wrists tied to one roller, ankles to the other, the true horror began. Slowly, methodically, the rollers would turn, pulling the body taut. Ligaments strained, joints protested, bones whispered threats of betrayal. And still the cranks turned. What made the rack so feared was not just the physical pain, but the anticipation. The slow, deliberate progression from discomfort to agony, from agony to something worse. The breaking of the human spirit. Imagine lying there, bound, unable to move, the cold draft of the dungeon brushing across your skin as the ropes tightened. You hear the groan of the wooden rollers, slow and steady, as if savoring your suffering. There is no escape. You feel the subtle tearing beneath your skin, not sharp enough to end your life, but enough to remind you, moment by moment, that your body is no longer your own. And worse still, you know it hasn't even reached its limit. In England, during the reign of King Edward I, the rack became infamous in the Tower of London. The device earned the ominous nickname, the Duke of Exeter's Daughter, after its supposed inventor, Sir Thomas Exeter. Political dissidents, spies, and accused heretics alike felt its cruel embrace. It was a favored tool not for punishment, but for confession. After all, words spoken through pain carry a certain urgency. Whether those words were true hardly mattered to those in power. But the rack wasn't just a tool of the English crown. Across the continent, it found its way into the hands of inquisitors and monarchs alike. In Spain during the Inquisition, it was one of many methods employed to extract truth from those accused of spiritual betrayal. The accused had little choice. Speak and perhaps the cranking would stop. Remain silent and the machine would continue its slow work, indifferent to your endurance. And yet the true terror of the rack was psychological. Before the device ever touched your skin, its mere presence was enough to crumble resolve. The sight of it, large, imposing, impossible to ignore, planted seeds of dread. Prisoners who saw it prepared themselves for agony they had only imagined before. Some broke before the first turn of the crank, because sometimes fear is more effective than the pain itself. Think of the silence that followed each question. The inquisitor's voice, calm, steady, asking for confessions, names, secrets. No anger, no urgency. Just the cold patience of someone who knows they will win. Because the rack never tired. It never faltered. It never lost patience. The only question was how long you would hold out. Accounts from the time describe victims leaving the rack permanently changed. Shoulders dislocated beyond repair, limbs stretched to grotesque proportions, unable to walk, unable to stand. But worse was the inner damage, the knowledge that their body had been broken not by fate, but by the hands of other men, strangers who smiled as they turned the wheel. But like many instruments of torment, the rack eventually fell out of favor. In later centuries, it came to be seen not as a tool of justice, but as a symbol of cruelty and unchecked power. Its use was quietly abandoned as laws changed and societies sought to distance themselves from their brutal past. Today, replicas of the rack sit behind glass in museums, silent and still. Tourists walk by, snapping photos, barely pausing to think of what once happened on those wooden beams. The ropes are clean now, the rollers unmoving. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The quiet creak of wood under tension, the whispered pleas of those who came before, the relentless turn of the crank. And perhaps that is the rack's final cruelty. Even when it is no longer in use, it still stretches something inside us. A tension between what we are and what we fear we could become. A reminder that beneath the thin veneer of civilization, there remains the capacity for great cruelty, not by wild beasts, but by human hands. So the next time you walk through a castle and you find yourself in a damp stone room with an ancient wooden frame lying forgotten in a corner, ask yourself, how many truths were spoken in this place, and how many lies torn from unwilling lips still echo in the stones? Because the rack did not just stretch bodies, it stretched truth itself, until no one could tell where the lies ended and the confessions began. The Pear of Anguish. In the cold shadows of medieval Europe, there existed a device so strange, so intimate in its cruelty, that even its appearance defied simple understanding. It wasn't large and imposing like the rack. It wasn't a towering menace like the Iron Maiden. No, this was something smaller, more personal, a device that whispered rather than roared. They called it the Pear of Anguish. At first glance, it hardly seemed threatening. Shaped like a metallic fruit, its polished exterior gleamed softly in the dim torchlight. But appearances, as history has so often taught us, can be deceiving. The pear was no innocent object. It was crafted with a singular, sinister purpose: to invade, to pry open, to violate the most personal spaces of a person's body and soul. The mechanism was simple but cruel in its precision. The device consisted of 4 metallic petals bound together by a central screw. As the screw turned, the petals expanded outward, slowly widening the pear from within. Its application varied depending on the cruelty of its wielder. Legends speak of it being used in the mouths of those accused of blasphemy, forcing their jaws apart until words became impossible. Others whisper darker tales of the pear used in far more sensitive regions of the body, tailored to punish according to the crime imagined by the accuser. But beyond the physical torment, what made the Pear of Anguish so horrifying was its psychological violence. This was not a punishment carried out in public squares, where crowds gathered and justice, however cruel, was performed as spectacle. No, this was something hidden, a private horror delivered in the secret corners of dark dungeons, where only the victim and their tormentor bore witness to the pain inflicted. Picture the setting: a small, windowless chamber, its stone walls damp with the moisture of centuries. A single torch flickers, casting long, restless shadows. On a crude wooden table rests the pear, deceptively still, almost ornamental in its design. The interrogator speaks softly, almost kindly, laying the device in plain view. There is no need for raised voices. The threat speaks for itself. "Confess," the voice says, calm and measured. "Tell me what I need to know, or this will speak for you." It is not the pain itself that breaks people, but the anticipation of it, the slow turning of the screw, the faint creak of metal petals unfurling where they should not be. The body is betrayed from within, and worse, the mind knows it has no escape. History, however, is divided on the true use of the Pear of Anguish. Some scholars argue that no reliable records confirm its application in actual interrogations. Instead, they suggest the device may have been a later invention, perhaps a tool of folklore rather than fact, an object created to represent the moral decay of a cruel era, rather than a functional tool of punishment. But whether the pear was truly used in the dungeons of Europe, or whether it is merely the product of fearful imaginations, its message remains the same. Fear does not need truth to take root. The image alone, a small device designed to cause such intimate suffering, was enough to terrify, enough to control. And in some ways, the pear's power lies in its size. A large machine like the rack relies on spectacle, but the pear relies on secrecy. It reminds us that cruelty doesn't always need to be grand. Sometimes the smallest things carry the sharpest edges. Sometimes terror hides in the details. Consider how many people through history were silenced not by swords or gallows, but by whispered threats in the dark. No public condemnation, no crowds to witness their fall. Just them and the cold certainty of what awaited if they spoke out. The Pear of Anguish embodies that silence, a quiet, mechanical reminder that some punishments are meant not to be seen, but to be remembered, in nightmares, in trembling hands, in the shame of those who survived. Modern historians and museums display versions of the pear today, behind glass cases, stripped of their terrible purpose. Tourists peer at them curiously, some shuddering, some dismissing them as legends. But what they miss is this. Whether real or symbolic, the pear did its job perfectly. It planted fear in the minds of all who heard its name. And fear, after all, is the most reliable form of control. So when you next see an object that looks harmless, sitting quietly on a shelf or behind glass, ask yourself, what was it made for? Who held it centuries ago? And what did they hope to achieve? Because history is filled with tools like the Pear of Anguish, deceptively simple, hauntingly effective, and always reminding us of humanity's capacity to hurt itself in ways both physical and unseen. And perhaps the greatest anguish of all is knowing that even when the device itself has rusted away, the fear it created still lingers, waiting in the corners of our collective memory, ready to bloom again when darkness falls. The Judas Cradle. In the darkest corners of human invention, where cruelty and ingenuity collide, there exists a device so disturbingly precise in its purpose that its very design chills the soul. It was called the Judas Cradle, a name that echoes betrayal and suffering, woven together into one terrifying concept. Unlike other mechanisms of torment that relied on brute force, the Judas Cradle was disturbingly elegant in its simplicity. At its center stood a tall, pyramid-shaped seat, its pointed tip rising upward like a cold metallic spire. The victim was suspended above it by ropes or pulleys, arms often bound behind their back, their entire weight supported by the very structure they feared most. Slowly, methodically, they were lowered onto the sharp apex, their body forced to bear its own weight against the unyielding point. It wasn't the suddenness of pain that defined the Judas Cradle, but the slow, excruciating realization of inevitability. There was no quick release, no sudden end. Only the gradual surrender of the human body to gravity and steel. Minute by minute, hour by hour, the body betrayed itself, muscles trembling under the strain, joints burning with fatigue, while the mind wrestled with its own helplessness. Picture the scene. A cold, stone chamber, the air thick with silence and dread. Flickering torchlight casts long, shifting shadows across damp walls. In the center of the room stands the cradle, silent, unmoving, yet somehow alive in its stillness. Around it, inquisitors or executioners, faces hidden beneath hoods or cowls, watch without a word. Their silence is worse than mockery. It is the silence of indifference. The victim, suspended above the cruel pyramid, feels the rough rope cutting into their wrists, the burn of restraint. They hang there, knowing what comes next. Gravity is not a weapon that can be bargained with. Slowly, the rope is loosened. The descent begins, and in that slow, steady fall, terror reaches its purest form. Some accounts suggest that those condemned to the Judas Cradle were left in this state for hours, even days, allowed short reprieves only to prolong the ordeal. The human body, when faced with such unnatural posture, rebels in ways that defy imagination. Muscles seize, ligaments stretch, and yet, you remain alive, fully conscious of your fate. But beyond the physical suffering, the Judas Cradle was a psychological masterpiece of cruelty. The slow lowering, the forced confrontation with one's own fragility, turned each moment into a battle between mind and matter. Victims were not just enduring pain, they were enduring the anticipation of pain, which some argue is far worse. And there was symbolism too. The pyramid itself, rising upward, resembled the pinnacle of false promises. Just as Judas betrayed for silver, those who faced the cradle were accused of betraying their faith, their rulers, or their fellow man. Whether guilty or innocent was irrelevant. The accusation alone was enough. Historical accounts place the Judas Cradle in the hands of various European inquisitors during the later Middle Ages and Renaissance, particularly within the shadowy tribunals of Italy and Spain. It was rarely used for the spectacle of public punishment, instead reserved for those interrogations carried out in secret, where no witnesses would soften their accounts and no cries would reach sympathetic ears. And yet, as with many such devices, some modern historians debate its actual prevalence. Was the Judas Cradle a widely used tool or a dark exaggeration born from the fears of a suspicious age? Some argue that many devices attributed to inquisitors were constructed later as part of the 18th and 19th century fascination with medieval cruelty. Replicas of the Judas Cradle, built centuries after its supposed invention, now stand silent in museums, their true history obscured by time and myth. But in a way, whether it was used frequently or not matters little, because fear is not bound by fact. The very idea of the Judas Cradle, the thought of being left suspended above that merciless point, waiting for your body to give out, was enough to make people tremble. In that sense, it succeeded perfectly as a tool of control. A device doesn't need to be used to be effective. Sometimes its possibility is enough. Imagine being dragged through the narrow stone corridors of a medieval fortress, the iron-shod boots of guards echoing on the floor behind you. You are brought into a room lit only by the dim, flickering glow of torches. And there it stands, waiting for you. Silent, patient, a pyramid of iron and wood. You hear no laughter, no mockery from your captors, only the soft creak of ropes being prepared. Then comes the worst part, the waiting. You are suspended there, moments before your descent begins, and in that moment, time stretches on forever. Every second feels like an hour. You hope, irrationally, for mercy, for some last-minute reprieve, but none comes. Slowly, gravity reclaims you, and the pyramid greets you with its cold, unfeeling touch. And yet the true horror is not the device itself, but what it reveals about those who built it. Someone designed the Judas Cradle. Someone crafted its angles, measured its height, tested its strength. It was not an accident of nature, but a product of human hands. Hands capable of beauty and art, but also capable of this. Today, the Judas Cradle has become one of the most infamous torture devices in the world, often depicted in books, films, and documentaries. Replicas sit in museum displays, sometimes polished clean of their gruesome past, other times left rusted and jagged, as if to remind us that history, no matter how far removed, still casts a long shadow. But as you stare at its cold, metallic form behind protective glass, remember this: the real terror of the Judas Cradle was never the device itself. It was the minds that imagined it, the systems that justified it, in the silence of those who watched it happen. Because the Judas Cradle didn't just pierce the flesh, it pierced something far deeper: trust, humanity, hope. And in the end, perhaps that is the greatest betrayal of all. The Brazen Bull. In the dusty annals of ancient Greece, where art and science flourished alongside conquest and cruelty, there emerged a device so disturbingly imaginative that it blurred the line between punishment and performance. Its name was the Brazen Bull, a hollow sculpture of gleaming bronze shaped in the form of a mighty beast, yet built not to celebrate life, but to imprison and silence it. The story begins in the city of Acragas, known today as Agrigento in Sicily, during the rule of a tyrant named Phalaris. His reign, like many of his era, was marked by both cultural achievement and ruthless control. According to legend, It was to this man that an inventor named Perios presented his creation, a device he claimed would both punish the condemned and entertain the masses. At first glance, the Brazen Bull was a work of art, meticulously crafted by skilled hands, its body smooth and polished, reflecting the Mediterranean sun. Its form was noble, majestic even, as though it belonged in a temple, not a place of execution. But within its hollow belly, a darker purpose lay waiting. The victim would be placed inside the belly of the bull through a hidden door along its flank. Once sealed within, a fire was lit beneath the metal sculpture. Slowly, inexorably, the bronze began to heat, turning the interior into an oven of suffocating heat. And as the occupant cried out in pain and desperation, the clever design of the bull revealed its most horrifying feature. You see, the head of the bull was not merely decorative. Inside, a series of tubes and chambers transformed human screams into something else, the sound of a bull's roar. To the crowds gathered outside, it seemed as though the statue itself had come alive, bellowing in fury and anguish. What began as one man's suffering became a theatrical spectacle for the amusement of others. Legend has it that when Perios first presented his invention to Phalaris, he spoke with pride of its engineering, claiming that no other device in history could match its blend of artistry and cruelty. But the tyrant, whether disgusted by the man's arrogance or eager to test the invention's claims, ordered that Perilos himself be the first to feel its heat. And so the creator became the victim, locked inside his own monstrous invention. Whether this story is fact or fable is difficult to determine. Ancient historians often blurred the lines between truth and moral lesson. But what remains undeniable is that the legend of the Brazen Bull endures, a symbol of how easily human creativity can twist into cruelty. Imagine the scene: a clear Sicilian sky, the scent of the sea carried on a warm breeze. In the city square, the bronze bull gleams in the sunlight, an object of both beauty and dread. Crowds gather, murmuring in uneasy anticipation. The executioners work in silence, feeding the fire beneath the beast. And within, a lone soul waits, surrounded by cold metal that soon will become unbearably hot. Think of the psychological terror in that moment. Enclosed in darkness, knowing what is to come, yet powerless to prevent it. You feel the walls around you slowly warming, the air thinning, your voice rising in desperation, only to hear your own cries twisted and distorted into something inhuman, echoing through the bull's bronze head. It is a suffering designed not merely to punish, but to humiliate, to rob a person of their final dignity. Even their last cries of pain do not belong to them, but to the beast they inhabit. In the Brazen Bull, man is reduced to animal, voice turned into spectacle, existence transformed into entertainment. Some historians suggest that the Brazen Bull was never widely used, perhaps never used at all beyond the first stories. They argue that it was a cautionary tale, a symbolic warning against the dangers of tyranny and unchecked cruelty. Others believe it may have existed in some form, perhaps used rarely, but spoken of frequently, its legend growing far larger than its actual use. Regardless of its historical reality, the Brazen Bull achieved immortality through myth. In later centuries, it was cited in countless texts as the pinnacle of ancient cruelty, not because of its efficiency, but because of its creativity. Pain alone is one thing, but pain transformed into artifice, into mockery, into entertainment. That is something else entirely. Even today, replicas of the Brazen Bull stand in museums and exhibitions, their polished exteriors hiding their terrible purpose. Visitors stare at them, some curious, some uneasy, wondering how such beauty could conceal such horror. But that, perhaps, was always the point. The Brazen Bull wasn't meant to look terrifying. Its beauty was part of the cruelty, a perfect deception, and there is a lesson in that deception. Tyranny rarely wears the face of a monster. More often, it wears the face of progress, of innovation, of civilization itself. The bull was not some crude machine of suffering. It was a masterpiece, pain wrapped in art, and those who watched it roar from the safety of the crowd were complicit in its cruelty, whether they acknowledged it or not. So the next time you see a statue in a city square, gleaming beneath the sun, ask yourself, What stories does it hide? What hands built it, and for what purpose? History is filled with monuments that celebrate human greatness and conceal human darkness. The Brazen Bull stands as a chilling reminder of that truth, that the line between creation and destruction, between brilliance and brutality, is far thinner than we like to admit. And though the fires beneath it have long since gone cold, in our imaginations, the bull still roars. Not because someone lit the flames again, but because we have never truly forgotten what human beings are capable of building and destroying when ambition silences compassion. The breaking wheel. In the heart of medieval Europe, where cobbled streets echoed with sermons and superstitions alike, few punishments stirred as much dread as the breaking wheel. A simple object, in essence, a large wooden cartwheel, not unlike those that carried harvest from the fields. And yet in the town square, it was not a tool of labor, but a stage for agony. The breaking wheel, sometimes called the Catherine wheel, was both execution and performance. It served not only to punish the accused, but to send a message to all who watched. A message written not in ink, but in suffering. The accused would be brought forth before the assembled crowd. No quiet chambers, no secrecy. This was cruelty made public, woven into the fabric of communal life. People gathered, not with pity, but with anticipation, for in these spectacles they saw not only punishment, but reassurance. Reassurance that justice, however brutal, had been done, that those who broke the laws of man or God had been broken in return. The condemned was bound to the wheel, sometimes laid flat atop it, sometimes with their limbs woven between its spokes. Then the executioner would raise an iron bar or hammer and begin his grim work. But this was no mere blow to end suffering swiftly. No, each strike was calculated. Bones were broken methodically, starting from the limbs and working inward, following a precise pattern intended to prolong suffering without delivering immediate release. The executioner's blows shattered arms and legs, twisting the body unnaturally, yet carefully avoiding vital organs to ensure the person remained conscious. Between each strike, the crowd waited, their silence as heavy as the air itself. Every crack of bone, every cry from the victim, echoed through the streets like a hymn to human cruelty. But the worst part was not the pain. It was the waiting between the blows, the long, drawn-out anticipation of the next strike. In those moments, suspended between agony and silence, the mind turned against itself. Fear became a companion more cruel than any weapon. Some accounts describe how, after the breaking was complete, the shattered body was left woven into the wheel, which was then hoisted upright and displayed for all to see. Like a grotesque sculpture of pain, it served as both punishment and warning. Birds and insects gathered, the elements took their toll, and the crowd eventually dispersed, leaving behind only silence and memory. But perhaps the most famous legend connected to the wheel is that of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. According to tradition, Catherine, a learned and devout woman, defied a Roman emperor who sought to silence her Christian faith. Ordered to be broken on the wheel, she faced her punishment with unyielding courage. But the story tells us that when the wheel was set in motion, it shattered instead of her, a miracle that transformed the instrument of cruelty into her symbol of sainthood. Today, the Catherine wheel stands not only as a relic of torment, but also as a reminder of spiritual defiance. And yet, outside of legend, countless souls were not spared. Their stories did not end in miracles, but in silence, lost to history except for the echoes left behind in the dusty ledgers of courts and tribunals. Consider what it must have been like to stand before the wheel, to feel the rough wood against your back, to see the crowd gathered like vultures beneath a gray sky. You search the faces for sympathy, but find none. For them, you are not a person anymore. You are a lesson, a cautionary tale. And what of the executioner? Was he a sadist, delighting in the pain he inflicted? Or was he simply a man doing his duty, trapped in a role society had assigned him? Some records suggest that the more skilled executioners were admired, for they could prolong suffering without ending it too soon. Precision was valued. Mercy was rare. In some regions, variations of the wheel emerged. In Germany, it became known as the Rädern, where both common criminals and political enemies met their fate. In France and the Low Countries, the wheel stood tall in marketplaces and crossroads, where travelers would see the broken remains and be reminded of their own fragile mortality. But eventually, as the centuries wore on, the wheel fell out of favor. Enlightenment thinkers criticized such spectacles as barbaric, unworthy of civilized societies. Slowly, the wheels disappeared from the town squares, replaced not by mercy, but by quieter, more hidden forms of punishment. And yet, the memory of the wheel lingered, like a shadow cast across the history of justice. Today, the phrase "on the wheel" survives only in books and museums. Few imagine the terror it once inspired. A simple wooden circle, and yet it had the power to undo a human life, body, and soul. And perhaps that is what makes the breaking wheel so haunting. It reminds us that ordinary things, a wheel, a hammer, a public square, can be turned into instruments of horror when wielded without compassion. So the next time you see an old wooden wheel, half buried in a field or rusting beside a forgotten barn, consider its shape: circular, endless, a symbol of cycles, of violence repeated through history, of suffering that feeds itself. Because cruelty, like the wheel, turns endlessly when left unchecked. And in that turn, we must ask, are we spectators? Or will we finally step away from the crowd? The Scavenger's Daughter. Among the countless devices of torment conceived in the shadows of medieval Europe, few were as deceptive in appearance as the Scavenger's Daughter, where most instruments of suffering spread the human body apart, pulling, stretching, tearing. This cruel invention did the opposite. It crushed. It folded the body inward, turning a person into a grotesque imitation of themselves, as if forcing them to collapse beneath the weight of their own existence. The Scavenger's Daughter was born in the Tower of London during the reign of King Henry VIII, an era infamous for its political paranoia and brutal interrogations. It was the brainchild of Sir Leonard Skeffington, the lieutenant of the Tower, whose name became forever linked to the device. The English, with their taste for cruel irony, called it the Scavenger's Daughter, a twisted parody of gentility. A daughter in name only, in purpose, a merciless creation. The design was deceptively simple: a metal frame, shaped like an inverted capital A. The victim's body was forced into it, knees pressed up to the chest, head bowed, arms pulled inward and down. Once secured, the frame was tightened, compressing the body further and further, until joints popped, ribs cracked, and blood vessels burst under the relentless pressure. Unlike the rack, which broke you by pulling you apart, the Scavenger's Daughter broke you by making you collapse into yourself. It was an execution of the soul as much as of the body, a symbolic punishment. You are nothing, and you will be folded into nothing. Imagine the dread of facing this device in the tower's cold stone chambers. You would be led down the winding staircases beneath the fortress, where screams were muffled by ancient walls, where only the condemned and their tormentors tread. There in the flickering torchlight, the Scavenger's Daughter waited, silent, patient, and mercilessly efficient. The act of being placed inside was itself a violation of dignity. Your body bent and forced into shapes it was never meant to hold. Your breath squeezed out of you. And the pain? The pain was not sudden and sharp like a blade, but slow and crushing, a suffocation from within. Blood vessels in the face often burst, leaving the victim bruised and discolored, their own blood seeping from their pores and nose as a grotesque mask. But worse than the pain was what it represented. To be confined within the Scavenger's Daughter was to be reduced to something small, something insignificant. Your voice silenced not by fear, but by the simple fact that there was no space left for air. It was the perfect metaphor for political repression. Fold your enemies in on themselves until they break. The Tower of London's infamous reputation made this device all the more terrifying. Political prisoners, traitors, and religious dissenters all passed through its gates. Men who once walked among kings found themselves bowed and broken beneath this iron frame. Their titles, wealth, and influence were meaningless in the darkness below. Historical records suggest that the Scavenger's Daughter was often paired symbolically with the rack. The rack stretched prisoners to their limits. The daughter crushed them. Together, they represented the complete domination of the human form, expansion and contraction, suffering from both extremes. One such victim was Thomas Cottam, a Catholic priest accused of treason against the crown. Accounts say he was so violently compressed within the frame that his face swelled and blood poured from his nose and ears. Yet even after such torment, his spirit remained intact, a reminder that the human will sometimes survive where the body does not. But like many tools of torture, the Scavenger's daughter was eventually retired as shifting political tides and evolving ideas of justice rendered such brutality unfashionable. It faded from use, surviving only in the records of those dark days and in the rusted frame displayed today in the tower's armory. Silent but never truly forgotten. And perhaps that is where its true power lies. Devices like the Scavenger's daughter are no longer used, but they remain as artifacts of a time when fear ruled more absolutely than law. They remind us how fragile the line is between civilization and savagery, how quickly we can reduce a person, any person, to something less than human. But the question lingers, what kind of mind invents such a thing? Is it the mind of a sadist or of a bureaucrat seeking efficiency and pain? Perhaps it is worse. Perhaps it is the mind of someone who believed they were doing what was necessary. That cruelty in the right hands could be justified. That, in truth, is the most terrifying part. Torture devices are not relics of chaos but of order. They are created not in madness, but in the cold, rational corridors of power. Measured, calculated, controlled. Today, tourists wander through the Tower of London, snapping photos beside the Scavenger's daughter without fully grasping the suffering it once contained. Its iron frame stands empty now, polished by time and curiosity. But if you listen closely, you might still hear the echoes of strained breath, the creak of joints forced beyond their limits, the quiet collapse of a soul bent too far. Because cruelty, like metal, leaves an imprint long after the flesh is gone. And somewhere in the shadows of our history, the Scavenger's daughter still waits, silent, watching, ready to remind us of what happens when compassion is crushed by power. Thumbscrews. At first glance, the thumbscrews seemed almost laughably simple. No towering bronze statues, no elaborate wheels, no Iron Maidens waiting with open arms. Just two small metal plates connected by a screw designed to crush. And yet, in that simplicity lay a cruelty far more intimate than grander devices could ever achieve. Unlike the large theatrical instruments of torture designed for public spectacles, the thumbscrews were personal, silent, portable. They did not need a crowd. They did not need a stage. They needed only a pair of hands to operate them and a victim to fall beneath them. The thumbscrews were often used in the quieter corners of interrogation chambers, where the goal was not execution, but information. Secrets, names, confessions. These were the treasures it sought to extract. The device was placed over the fingers or thumbs of the accused. Slowly, relentlessly, the screw was tightened, driving the metal plates together. Flesh compressed, bones shifted, splintered, and finally cracked. And it didn't stop there. In some variations, the device was applied to toes, or in particularly cruel cases, to the joints of the hand. Even the most basic human actions, grasping, walking, touching, became distant memories, replaced by searing agony. But the true terror of the thumbscrews was not in the immediate pain. It was in the methodical nature of their use. The interrogator didn't need to rush. He could pause between turns of the screw, allowing the victim's mind to fill the silence with dread. Each creak of the mechanism became a question. Will this turn break the bone, or will it be the next? Picture the scene. A stone-walled chamber deep beneath a fortress or courthouse. A single lantern casts flickering shadows, barely illuminating the worn wooden table where the thumbscrews rest, polished from countless hands. The interrogator sits across from the prisoner, calm, dispassionate. There are no raised voices, no dramatic accusations. Only the quiet question, who were your accomplices? And the cold certainty that refusal will bring another turn of the screw. The thumbscrews became notorious across Europe during the Middle Ages and Renaissance, used by inquisitors, magistrates, and soldiers alike. They were particularly favored in situations where silence could no longer be tolerated, where hesitation was seen as defiance. But not all victims were hardened criminals or spies. Sometimes the accused were ordinary men and women caught in the tides of suspicion, heretics, political enemies, or simple townsfolk falsely accused by jealous neighbors. They were dragged before their accusers, their innocence irrelevant, their words powerless against the machinery of fear. And what happens to a mind when the very hands it relies on are broken before its eyes? Imagine feeling your own body betray you, your fingers no longer able to grasp, no longer able to protect you. Pain strips away pride, strips away defiance, until all that remains is the desperate hope for release. But even release came at a price. Confessions obtained under torture were rarely truthful. People spoke whatever their tormentors wished to hear, if only to make the pain stop. Names of friends, lovers, strangers, all were offered up to the darkness, feeding a cycle of fear and betrayal that spread like wildfire through villages and cities alike. In some cases, thumbscrews were not used alone. They were paired with other tools, the rack, the iron boot, the strappado, each device complementing the other in a symphony of suffering. If one failed to break the spirit, another would surely finish the job. And yet, despite its cruelty, the thumbscrews were not built by monsters in some distant, forgotten age. They were designed, manufactured, and wielded by ordinary people. Judges, soldiers, priests, people who likely ate supper with their families after the day's work was done. People who believed they were preserving order, defending the faith, protecting the kingdom. That is perhaps the most unsettling truth. Torture devices like the thumbscrews are not relics of chaos, but of control. They represent the cold, calculated belief that pain can extract truth, that fear can build a safer world. History has shown us again and again how wrong that belief is, and yet it persists. Today, thumbscrews survive in museums, their rusted metal plates still stained by time. Visitors peer at them through glass, perhaps wincing, perhaps shaking their heads in disbelief. But few truly understand what it meant to sit across from one, to feel your hand locked in place, to watch the screw turn slowly as your will was tested. And even fewer recognize the echo of such cruelty in our modern world. For while the devices themselves may have vanished, the mindset that created them, the willingness to sacrifice humanity for control, lingers on. So the next time you clasp your hands together, feeling the quiet strength in your fingers, remember those who once could not. Remember the questions they faced, the impossible choices they were forced to make. And ask yourself, if you sat across from the thumbscrews, how long could you hold your silence? Because in the end, the thumbscrews were not just a test of flesh and bone. They were a test of the soul. And the silence that follows their turn is sometimes the loudest sound of all. The Heretic's Fork. Among the countless devices designed to extract obedience through suffering, few were as quietly terrifying as the Heretic's Fork. It was not grand in size. It was not designed to dismember or disfigure. No, its cruelty lay in its subtlety, in its ability to turn the act of survival itself into torment. At first glance, the Heretic's Fork appeared almost trivial, a thin metal rod, sometimes no larger than a foot in length, with sharpened prongs at both ends. But this simplicity was deceptive. One end of the fork was placed beneath the chin, pressing into the soft flesh there, while the other was fixed against the breastbone or collarbone. The device was strapped in place with leather bands around the neck, locking it into position, and then nothing. That was the horror. Unlike the rack, which tore your limbs apart, or the thumbscrews, which splintered your bones, the Heretic's Fork did not act immediately. It simply waited. And in the silence of that waiting, the human mind began to unravel. The victim could neither lower their head nor tilt it upward. Every muscle tremor, every unconscious nod, every weary sag of the neck drove the sharp metal prongs deeper into flesh. Sleep became impossible, rest unattainable. Even the simple act of exhaling too deeply risked impalement. It was in essence a punishment of endurance. How long could a human being hold their head upright, resisting fatigue, resisting gravity, resisting their own humanity? because the body in its frailty seeks rest. But the heretic's fork punished rest with pain. The device earned its ominous name during the Inquisitions of Europe, where it was used against those labeled heretics, witches, or political enemies. Men and women accused of deviating from the accepted truths of the church or state. Some confessions were forced through direct torture, but for others the fork was the slow and silent persuader. No screams echoed through the dungeons, only the sound of labored breath and stifled sobs. Picture the scene: a dark, airless cell, its stone walls slick with centuries of moisture. A single torch burns in the corner, its light flickering against the iron bars. In the middle of the room stands a figure, neither seated nor lying down, but standing, head rigid, body trembling. Their arms may be free, but they are prisoners still, trapped within the prison of their own exhaustion. Sweat beads along their brow, running down to the tip of the fork, where it mingles with blood. Their knees threaten to give out, but they cannot collapse. If they fall, the prongs will drive deeper still. And the tormentor? He does not need to shout or strike. He simply waits, seated in the shadows, watching as time does his work for him. Occasionally he may speak, confess, a single word, a single command. It is the silence between the words that breaks you, because the fork turns your own body into the instrument of torture. Every muscle becomes your enemy. Every heartbeat, every tremble of fatigue brings you closer to agony. Victims were often left for hours, sometimes days, depending on their will, and the patience of their captors. Unlike other devices, the fork left relatively little visible damage. The scars it inflicted were within, in the mind, in the soul, where they lingered long after the wounds healed. It was perhaps the perfect tool for an era obsessed with outward piety. One could walk away from the heretic's fork without missing limbs or shattered bones, yet carry the weight of its terror for a lifetime. Historical records suggest that variations of the fork existed throughout Europe, not just among the Spanish Inquisition, but in Italy and France, where whispers of heresy often carried more danger than open rebellion. In some cases, the fork was inscribed with the words, "I recant," or "I deny," as if to mock the prisoner with their supposed guilt. Other versions had prongs on both the chest and the throat, immobilizing the head completely, allowing not even the smallest motion without pain. But beyond the physical, the heretic's fork reveals something deeply unsettling about the human mind. We are not wired to endure stillness. Our bodies fidget, adjust, relax. The fork punished these very instincts. It turned the act of being human, of blinking, swallowing, nodding, into a crime. And that perhaps was its cruelest design. Not the sharp metal, but the way it forced you to betray yourself. Today, replicas of the heretic's fork sit in glass displays, their polished surfaces reflecting the faces of curious onlookers. Some glance at them and move on, seeing only an antique. Others linger, feeling something colder beneath the surface. The quiet echo of a time when silence was enforced not by law, but by fear. And yet, even now the idea lingers. How many people in our modern world wear invisible forks around their necks? Silenced by fear, held upright by the pressure of conformity, unable to relax for fear of the consequences. Perhaps the heretic's fork was not just a medieval tool, but a metaphor for every system that demands compliance at the cost of our humanity. So the next time you lower your head in exhaustion or let your body rest without fear, remember those who could not. Remember the weight of metal against flesh, the ache of stillness, the cost of silence. Because the heretic's fork didn't just pierce the skin, it pierced the will. And long after the metal rusted away, its echo remains, in every whispered confession, every bowed head, every voice forced into silence. The Spanish chair. Hidden deep within the shadowy chambers of medieval Europe's darkest dungeons, stood one of the most insidious torture devices ever conceived, the Spanish chair. At first glance, it resembled an ordinary piece of furniture, a tall-backed wooden chair, wide enough to hold a man, sturdy enough to support his weight. But upon closer inspection, the cruel details revealed themselves. Its surface was not smooth, but lined with countless sharp iron spikes, protruding from the seat, the backrest, the armrests, and even the footrest. It was not built for comfort, it was built for suffering. The Spanish chair, also known in some regions as the iron chair, became a staple of inquisitorial torture, designed to punish and extract confessions from those accused of crimes, both spiritual and secular. Its construction was deceptively simple. Wood reinforced with metal, covered in steel spikes placed in such a way that no part of the body could avoid their sting. But its cruelty lay not merely in its physical pain. It was a device of psychological terror, a throne of agony that turned sitting into torture and stillness into hell. Imagine being led into a cold, dimly lit chamber where the chair sits alone beneath a hanging lantern. The shadows of its spikes dance across the stone walls like the claws of some monstrous beast. The interrogator, calm and methodical, gestures for you to sit. There is no shouting, no dramatic threats, only the quiet, inescapable knowledge of what awaits. Bound tightly with leather straps across your chest, arms, and legs, escape is impossible. The spikes do not pierce deep enough to cause fatal wounds. Not at first. They break the skin, they draw blood, they spread pain across every inch of your body. But they do not grant the mercy of unconsciousness. You remain awake, alert, aware. But the torment does not stop with the chair itself. Some accounts describe how fires were lit beneath the seat, heating the metal spikes until they seared the flesh of the victim. The sharp sting of the spikes turned into a slow burn, cooking the body from below, while the upper spikes continued to dig into the skin. In other variations, weights were added to the victim's lap, forcing their body deeper into the spikes, amplifying the pain with every second. It was suffering by design, a methodical, mechanical breaking of the human spirit. And then came the questions. Confess, the interrogator might say, his voice cold and steady. Speak the truth, and the pain will end. But what was the truth? Often the accusations were vague, the evidence non-existent. Heresy, treason, witchcraft, crimes defined not by facts but by suspicion. The chair didn't seek justice, it sought compliance. And in the face of such agony, the mind broke long before the body did. The Spanish chair was widely used during the height of the Spanish Inquisition, though its influence spread beyond Spain into Italy, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. It became a tool not only of religious persecution, but of political repression. Those who spoke out against the crown, who questioned the church, who defied the local magistrate, all could find themselves strapped to its cruel embrace. But perhaps what makes the Spanish chair so terrifying is its silence. Unlike the Brazen Bull, which roared for the crowd, or the breaking wheel, whose splintering wood and bone echoed through the town square, the Spanish chair was a private torment. The only sounds were the victim's ragged breaths, the faint creak of leather straps, and the quiet hiss of hot iron meeting flesh. And what of the executioners? Were they monsters? Perhaps some were. But more chilling is the possibility that they were ordinary men, following orders, believing in the righteousness of their cause. They saw the chair not as an instrument of cruelty, but as a necessary evil to preserve order, faith, and obedience. But for the victim, strapped to that throne of spikes, there was no such rationalization. There was only pain, relentless, inescapable. Consider the psychological torture layered within the physical. The chair forced you to remain still, yet every instinct screamed to move away from the spikes. Struggling only made it worse. Shifting your weight brought new points of agony. You were trapped in your own body, your suffering prolonged by your inability to find comfort. And then, even when you confessed, whether truthfully or falsely, the torment didn't always end. Some victims were left strapped to the chair for hours afterward, their blood soaking into the wood, their skin blistering against the hot iron as a final reminder that mercy was a rare commodity in those dark days. Over time, as Europe slowly emerged from the shadows of medieval justice and into the era of enlightenment, the Spanish chair fell out of favor. Rational minds condemned it as barbaric. Laws were reformed, punishments softened, and public displays of torture became relics of a more brutal past. Yet the chair itself remained. Some survived the centuries, now displayed in museums, stripped of their terror but not their history. Tourists peer at them through glass, snapping photographs, shaking their heads in disbelief that such cruelty ever existed. But cruelty, like history, is never truly gone. The Spanish chair reminds us of how easily power, when unchecked, turns comfort into suffering, furniture into weapons, and justice into horror. And perhaps the greatest terror of all is how ordinary it looks. A chair, something we all use daily, something we trust to hold us in rest and safety. The Spanish chair took that trust and shattered it. Because that is what true cruelty does. It hides itself in the familiar. So the next time you sit, feeling the soft embrace of your chair, remember that in another time, another place, that same seat could have been your prison. And wonder, just for a moment, how thin the line is between comfort and torment. The lead sprinkler. In the dark recesses of medieval torture chambers, where firelight flickered across stone walls and shadows danced like specters, there existed a device both deceptively ordinary and unimaginably cruel. It was called the lead sprinkler. At first glance, it appeared harmless, almost ceremonial, a metal vessel with a hollow stem and a perforated tip, resembling the sacred tools used by priests to sprinkle holy water upon the faithful. But where the church's aspergillum dispensed blessings, this cruel twin offered only agony. For inside the lead sprinkler, there was no water, no sanctity, only molten metals, boiling oil, searing tar, and, most terrifying of all, liquid lead. The process was as precise as it was horrifying. The executioner would heat the metals until they bubbled and hissed, their surfaces writhing like living things. The lead sprinkler's reservoir was filled with this molten substance, its handle designed to insulate the torturer's hand from the heat. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the torturer would tip the device over the victim, allowing a single viscous drop to fall. One drop, that was all it took. A single bead of molten lead striking bare skin did not just burn, it destroyed. It tore through flesh, searing nerves and muscle in an instant, leaving behind a crater of agony. If the drop fell upon the chest or back, it could be survived, though not without scars both physical and mental. But when aimed at more delicate regions, the face, the hands, or, most mercilessly, the eyes, the damage was permanent. And this was no reckless, frenzied torture. Number. The true terror of the lead sprinkler was its precision. Each drop was calculated, each moment of silence between drops carefully chosen to maximize dread. The victim would lie immobilized, watching as the executioner slowly raised the sprinkler, tilted it ever so slightly, and let gravity deliver its sentence. Consider for a moment the agony of anticipation, the heat radiating from the bowl, the faint hiss of molten lead shifting inside. You cannot move, for if you do, the next drop may fall where you least expect it. You cannot plead. Your voice would be drowned out by the bubbling metal. All you can do is wait. Wait for the moment when pain becomes your world. The lead sprinkler was not always used to kill. Often it was wielded to extract confessions, to humiliate, to disfigure. Victims would leave the chamber alive, but broken, scarred faces, blinded eyes, or hands so burned that they could never again hold a pen or a sword. They were left as walking reminders of obedience through terror. Historians believe that the lead sprinkler was used across Europe during the medieval and early Renaissance periods, particularly by inquisitors and state torturers. It was favored not for its spectacle, but for its effectiveness. A single session with the lead sprinkler often yielded results where racks and wheels failed. The pain was immediate, impossible to endure, and terrifyingly easy to control. But beyond its physical cruelty, the lead sprinkler carried a deeper, symbolic horror. Molten lead, in religious ceremonies, was sometimes poured into molds to create sacred icons. In the hands of the torturer, this same element became a tool of desecration, turning creation into destruction. The parallel was not lost on those who suffered beneath it. Imagine, too, the psychological toll, the scent of burning flesh mingling with the sharp tang of molten metal, the hiss as lead met skin, the choking smoke rising in thin tendrils, filling the chamber with the scent of suffering. These were not fleeting moments of pain, they were nightmares burned into the mind. Some accounts describe victims being forced to watch as molten metal was sprinkled upon others before their turn came, a cruel form of psychological preparation. They would see what was coming, they would smell it, hear it, and know there was no escape. And the executioners? Were they demons in human form, reveling in the suffering they caused? Or were they simply instruments of a darker system, performing their duty without passion, without hatred, without compassion? Perhaps the most terrifying possibility is that they felt nothing at all. The lead sprinkler stands today as a haunting example of how cruelty often hides behind simplicity. No gears, no wheels, no cages, just metal, heat, and gravity. It did not require elaborate machinery to inflict its horrors. Only a hand steady enough to pour pain, drop by drop. Today, lead sprinklers sit silently behind museum glass, their surfaces blackened by centuries of rust and forgotten suffering. Visitors may pass by without a second thought, mistaking them for kitchen tools or ceremonial relics. But those who pause to read the small plaque beneath them understand. They know what the bowl once contained. They know what fell from its tip. And in that knowledge, a chill runs deeper than the coldest iron. Because cruelty, in its purest form, does not need grandeur. It needs only intention. So the next time you see something simple, a tool, a vessel, an ordinary object, ask yourself what hands once held it. For history is filled with ordinary things that became instruments of extraordinary pain. And somewhere, deep in the forgotten corridors of time, the lead sprinkler still drips. Not molten metal, but memory. A memory of suffering so precise, so deliberate, that even centuries cannot erase its burn. The iron spider. Hidden in the darkest corners of medieval torture chambers, there existed a device so cruel, so pointedly symbolic, that its very mention struck terror into the hearts of women accused of the gravest sins. This device was known as the iron spider, or, as it came to be called in later centuries, the breast ripper. Its design was deceptively simple: 4 or more curved metal claws, each sharpened to a deadly point, set into a handle or mounted to a wall. Sometimes cold, sometimes heated, until it glowed a fierce, burning red, the iron spider's purpose was not mere pain. It was mutilation, and not just any mutilation, but the destruction of that which society viewed as the essence of womanhood. The victims of the iron spider were most often women accused of adultery, witchcraft, blasphemy, or defiance against male authority. Crimes that in many cases required no evidence beyond rumor and jealousy. And for these so-called offenses, they were punished not with death alone, but with the symbolic destruction of their bodies, a reminder to others that defiance of social order would be repaid in kind. Picture the scene: a cold stone chamber, damp with centuries of cruelty. In the center, the accused stands trembling, surrounded by men cloaked in the authority of the church, the law, or both. The iron spider is brought forth, its cruel shape glistening in the torchlight. If it is to be heated, it is placed into the coals, its claws turning a molten red. The room fills with the sharp scent of burning iron. The woman's garments are torn away, her chest exposed not only to the cruel claws of the device, but to the eyes of those who judge her. Humiliation was part of the punishment, stripping her of her dignity before stripping her of her flesh. And then, without mercy, the claws were applied to the breast. Sometimes the torturer would press the spider directly against the flesh, searing it in an instant, burning deep into the tissue. In other cases, the claws were hooked into the breast and then yanked away, ripping flesh from bone in a brutal imitation of an animal attack. Blood flowed freely, mingling with the smoke and ash of the burning metal. But perhaps the worst variation of all involved fixing the spider to a wall or beam, and then violently pulling the woman's body backward, tearing her skin and muscle as she was ripped away from the iron grasp. It was an act of physical and symbolic violence, not merely a punishment of the body, but a statement that her very femininity, her role as mother and nurturer, had been destroyed. And yet the pain itself was only part of the torment. Imagine the psychological devastation: to be marked forever, not by your own crimes, but by the violence of others. To be left not only with scars, but with a body no longer whole in the eyes of a society that prized purity and motherhood above all else. Even if a woman survived, she would be an outcast, her mutilated body serving as a permanent reminder of her sin. There are few detailed historical records of specific victims. Most of their names have been lost, erased by time and shame. But traces of the Iron Spider appear in inquisitorial documents from Germany, France, and Spain, places where accusations of witchcraft and moral deviance were enough to justify horrors beyond imagination. In some cases, the Iron Spider was used in public executions, with crowds gathered not to protest, but to watch. What they witnessed was not justice, but a terrifying performance of power over vulnerability. And what of the men who wielded the spider? Were they zealots, convinced they were purging evil from the world? Or were they sadists, hiding their cruelty behind the veil of law? Perhaps worse, they were ordinary men, following orders, believing they were protecting their communities from moral decay. The Iron Spider represents one of the most haunting truths of human history, that torture is not always about punishment. Sometimes it is about erasure, about stripping a person not only of their life, but of their identity. The breast ripper was not designed simply to cause pain. It was designed to take from a woman the very part of her body society used to define her worth. Today, the Iron Spider sits in museums and dark collections, its claws rusted, its sharpness dulled by time. Visitors peer at it through glass, some with curiosity, some with horror, most unable to comprehend the suffering it once inflicted. But beneath its silent form lies the echo of countless unheard screams, the cries of women whose stories were buried alongside their dignity. And still, the Iron Spider lingers in our collective memory, not because we use such devices today, but because the mindset that created them, the belief that some bodies deserve to be controlled, punished, destroyed, has not been fully erased. In its cold iron, we see a warning of what happens when justice becomes cruelty, when power becomes unchecked, when fear of difference turns into violence. So the next time you see a spider's web, delicate yet dangerous, remember the Iron Spider and ask yourself, how fragile is the line between protection and destruction, between judgment and mercy? Because cruelty, like a spider, waits in the shadows, and when it strikes, it leaves scars far deeper than the flesh. Ending. And now, as our journey through these chilling chapters of history comes to an end, I want to ask you, which story disturbed you the most? Which device left you in shock? Or perhaps made you wonder how far the human mind can go when it loses compassion? Let me know in the comments below. I read them all. And if this video made you think, or if it opened your eyes to a part of history rarely spoken aloud, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps more people discover these hidden stories. Make sure to subscribe so you won't lose this channel among the countless shadows of the internet. And share this video with your friends. Maybe they too are brave enough to learn what humanity is capable of when fear and cruelty take the throne. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and remember, some pieces of history are forgotten for a reason.